I'm the founder of Income Growth Advisors. I'm a registered investment advisor. I also have a startup called Optima Process Systems, Inc. And we look at process systems with applications in the energy space that are impactful, or ESG. What I'm going to talk about is basically the conundrum that we are faced today with, and then introduce our panelists and have some hopefully inspired conversation. So I'm just going to state what is probably obvious to everybody, but ESG, environment, social governance, has really accelerated in the last few decades as wealthy families and individuals found that they had so much money that they really started to say, well, how can I make an impact beyond just simply chasing returns? And this has fueled impact investing and ESG investing, and it's had tremendous momentum. However, in recent years, last few decades, or last decade, I'd say, the idea of greenwashing, fraudulently claiming that you do certain environmental things, or maybe things like diversity, equity, inclusion, or governance, they really weren't delivering as much as what they promised. And so it was a little fraudulent. There's been some blowback there. And particularly in the energy space, Marty and I have had this ongoing conversation because what we've seen in terms of energy policy, particularly in Europe, have appeared to have been mistakes. So Europe took a policy where they wanted to shutter a lot of nuclear and fossil and switch overnight to renewables, which in concept made sense, but really put themselves into a difficult position, which in fact gave certain leverage to Vladimir Putin before the invasion of Ukraine. And energy is critical to helping economies grow and drive UN sustainability goals, number 1 and 2, ending poverty and lifting people out of poverty. So there are a lot of mixed messages. The obvious one in the US is that we've really cut back on producing fossil fuels and our prices are higher. Yet at the same time, we look at China and India are building coal-fired electrical plants that are producing more emissions, while we have significantly reduced it. But the American consumer, has paid for this, and it's problematic. It's inflationary. So what I hope to do is get a thoughtful discussion by talking to thought leaders and practitioners. We have a very talented group today. I'm going to briefly introduce everyone, and basically it'll be 10 minutes. Each person will give their elevator pitch, who they are, what their company does, and then talk about, the change in ESG and the new directions that are evolving. Because since this is a family office conference, we want to see where new markets are developing. And we have 3 speakers. We have Andreas Deutschmann of Palladium Capital. He is an investment banker. He will start, and then followed by Richard Zimmerman, who is a partner at the We Family Offices. They run $12 billion, and Richard Zimmerman, well, I'll get to him a little more, but everybody on the panel has a specialty and skill set in the ESG area. And Nidhi, Chadda, who went to Harvard and Wharton and looks like she's calling in from Timbuktu. I love that background. As I said, I'll make a quick introduction before everyone starts, and figure 10 minutes. I'll set in a timer. So I'll say, 2 minutes or whatever, just so we can move through things. But we'll have a robust Q&A after all 3 speakers have spoken. So about Andreas, I spoke with him a little bit this week about what his practice is. He helped fund companies raising $5 to $150 million. He's worked at Deloitte and JP Morgan and done audit risk. And his areas in the ESG, I guess I would call call them verticals, are in clean energy, battery storage, and carbon sequestration. I'd like him to talk about that after he talks about who he is and his company. But he also mentioned one particular project that they're working on, which resonated with me, and they are working on a green methanol fuel cell, which was developed by somebody who developed the Audi Quattro. So Andreas, if you'd take it from there, please tell us about yourself, your company, where you invest.
Sure, thank you. Thank you, Tyler. And thank you, Marty, for gathering this august group of individuals yesterday and today. Just like to clarify, I didn't go to Wharton, I didn't go to Harvard, I'm not managing $12 billion. So thank you. So as said, I'm an SVP at Palladium Capital Group. We're a boutique investment bank based here in New York City. Prior to that, I led teams in due diligence, investment management, and risk management as an MD at JP Morgan, as a VP at John Hancock, and as a manager at Deloitte & Touche. I carried out those duties in Chicago, Boston, New York, Vienna, Luxembourg, Zurich, Singapore, and Tokyo. And in terms of background, I have a CPA from the University of Illinois and an MBA in economics, finance, and international business from the University of Chicago. Last year, as an adjunct professor, I taught at the Central European University, teaching the venture capital course for the executive MBA program. CEU is a university that was founded by George Soros back in the day. And formerly, I was a corporate member of the Council of Foreign Relations. So in terms of how I source projects for my clients, I use my network from Asia, Europe, and the US. I'm a product of some off the boaters, a German mother and Austrian father. My first language is German. Have a lot of affinity for the engineers in German-speaking Europe, namely mechanical, electrical, chemical, and thermal. And so I've gone and made inroads and contacts at the universities in Switzerland, Austria, and Germany. In those technical universities, I'm participating in their Shark Tanks. I'm seeing all the new entrepreneurs coming out and their founders. So that's giving me some a leg up. I'm also a member of most of the Chamber of Commerce's here in New York, Denmark, Germany, Austria, Luxembourg, Greece, Spain. They often bring groups of entrepreneurs to New York and do Shark Tanks. I coach those Shark Tanks or judge those Shark Tanks. I do the same thing at Columbia University for their entrepreneurial ecosystems. And one last thing I do, last September, I spoke at the United Nations General Assembly, the 77th Congress, immediately after his mayor, Eric Adams, on the topic of venture capital as a tool for developing Africa. And since then, I've gone to the Global Economic Forum in Qatar twice, Sheikh Al Sharm, the COP27 once, Davos, and last spring I was at the IMF and World Bank. So what does that all mean? I think I've got some interesting insights into what's going on in environment and all those last 5 conferences I mentioned it. That's always been the topic immediately following the war in Ukraine and inflation. Currently, maybe switching over to projects I'm working on. I can't really talk in great detail because I can only speak to qualified investors. I recognize that most of you folks are. Technically, I just have to do that before I get any kind of details. But things I'm working on, as mentioned by Tyler, is a green methanol fuel cell technology. Think about a hybrid gas engine, electric engine. Now we're putting green methanol as the engineer, is the drivetrain, much cleaner than the current situation, and goes twice as far as your typical Tesla. We're not going to compete in Tesla. This is something we're starting in Germany. As mentioned, the Audi engineer responsible for the Quattro is the engineer in this founding venture. But basically, we're not going to compete with the Teslas, which are in all the metropolitan areas, go 30, 40, 50, 70 miles a day, and they can hook up their own home electrical systems and they're charged. We're going for a long haul. That's delivery vans, buses, and trucks. And on the board of this particular company is a former Audi CEO and also some execs from BMW that help us connect us with the main trucking companies. This is pre-revenue, so it's a bit risky. And in order to make this all work, we need methanol at the fuel tanks. So just to tell a small story, March 7th, 1877, a guy called Gottlieb Daimler in Germany developed the internal combustion engine, put it on a car, and amazed the world with this technology. Everybody thought this is the greatest inventor ever, happiest guy on the planet. Not really. The happiest guy on the planet that day was actually John D. Rockefeller, because Gottlieb Daimler opened up the transportation market for his petroleum products and made John D. Rockefeller the richest man of all time as a percentage of GDP. And if you think about now, Saudi Aramco, Exxon, and Chevron, those are all former John D. Rockefeller companies before they were split up. So what do cars do? They sell fuel. We want them to sell methanol fuel. And how do you make methanol? Well, you can steam reform it or gasify it out of natural gas. Who's sitting on the most natural gas on the planet? Qatar, Saudi Aramco, and Exxon. So we've got made some forays into those organizations or kingdoms and trying to see if we can get some investor size to facilitate this entire program. Again, pre-revenue is a bit risky. And another situation we have in the US on the West is a molecular recycling plasma company. They take municipal waste, turn it into plastic and renewable energy. They're post-revenues. They have a large US waste management company as a customer, and they just brought on a chemical company. So this is not the only type of technology that exists, but they seem to have some traction or maybe a first runner advantage as that. On the other side, I am working with a long-short clean energy hedge fund. If you look at ICLN, the major ETF for clean energy, over the last 2.5 years, it's gone 26% down. These guys are 26% up. How are they doing that? On the shorting side. So if you think about what people say about clean energy, next 5 years, there'll be $3 to $5 trillion put into this space. It's like a gold rush. There's only so many technologies that are going to win, and a hell of a lot of them are going to lose. So if you think about 1849 in San Francisco, the gold rush, 1 out of 10,000 or 5,000 miners made it rich. The rest went bust. Who made the money? Levi Strauss, selling picks, shovels, and blue jeans to the rest of them. So we use the knowledge of the shorts that we gained from our partner in the hedge fund to help us when we're assessing new technologies to make sure we're not stepping into landmines or so on and so forth. So we find that particular situation very helpful. We also have another hedge fund that is basically on the commodities front. They're trading oil, they're trading ags. Ags, why? Well, they're going long corn when they think ethanol is tight in supply. They also try to go long short lithium by going to companies that have lithium that can't be directly short via commodities lithium at the present. We also bake that into our overall sourcing situations. A couple other points on a philanthropic basis. I work with a gentleman called Ari Pispinen of Astor in Finland. He's developed a solar cooker that works off a solar panel, and they put this into sub-Saharan nations. Why do they do this? Well, right now in sub-Saharan nations, in order to cook food, the family sends the kids out in the woods or the nearest timber. They cut it down, they bring it in, they cook it. The kids are deforesting the land, and they're spending time when they could be doing their homework, chopping down trees. So this is an interesting thing done by Ari. If you met him, you would love him. He's very tight with the guys with the Angry Birds situation. And Ari, when you meet him, he's like, he's going to solve global warming, and he's not stopping until he does. He's just one man wrecking crew. And if you go to visit him, if you ever do, I warn you, he's going to make you put on some cross-country skis and ski like 25 miles, after which several hours later, you'll be completely needing more energy, let's just say. Lastly, 2 weeks ago, my nephew's a cameraman, and he works with an off-Broadway theater producer, and they're scouting locations for eco-villages and permaculture up in the Northeast United States and Canada. I was the one driving it and funding it in the RV for the last 7 days, starting June 9th to June 16th. We went to Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Maine, Vermont, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and upstate New York, visiting these various sites. So I guess what I'm trying to say is I'm all in on cleaning up the environment. And if anyone has questions or wants to contact me later, please do. I'm happy to give more information.
Andreas,
Got 10
that's great.
minutes?
Put your contact information in the little chat box so people know how to get a hold of you. And I'm going to go to Richard Zimmerman. Richard, as I said, is a partner over at We Family Offices. They run $12 billion. And he's spent 2 decades working with wealthy clients. He provides advice and service to overall wealth management needs. So all 12 billion are not going to ESG, but a portion, maybe 10, 20%. And Richard advises on that. What I want Richard to talk about is I'm going to throw out a couple things, and he has his own thoughts, so I'll just let him freelance. But where are you allocating your money today? What is your process for selecting people to make those investment decisions? What companies to back? And then I think clearly what's interesting today is the political or ideological discussion. And, I would just frame it this way. Vivek Ramaswamy, he has Strive Asset Management, which is focused on not ESG, quote unquote, the fiduciary duty of maximizing returns. He's the author of a book called Woke Inc., and he's a Republican candidate for president. So on one hand, he's sort of anti-ESG. On the other hand, you have Larry Fink, who's the head of BlackRock, who's really been writing annual letters and driving the whole ESG movement, and has significant influence as they're the largest asset manager with 10 trillion, along with Vanguard and State Street. Those guys have tremendous influence in terms of how these ESG protocols are being deployed. I mean, they can really vote very effectively to change companies, whether they like it or not. So without any more delay, Richard, tell us about yourself, where you're putting your money, and what your thoughts are on ESG and how things are evolving.
Thanks, Tyson. And remind me of all the questions that you wanted me to follow here as I go through this. Thanks, Marty, and everybody. As Tyson said, I work with. Hold on. Sorry. I work with about 95 families, both in the US and non-US, very wealthy, and at a firm called We Family Offices. And we're an outsourced family office for all these families, non-discretionary. So our main job is to work with them for full family office, but also help them allocate their investments. We do that by picking managers. We're really not in the direct deals as much. We're going to find the managers to do that. Sometimes we'll do co-invest, and sometimes families will bring us in direct investments. But just in general, we think we're going to be better at picking the managers. We can talk about that as Tyson referenced. And for the families that care about this category, and I think we should just change the name of all of it, or not even have a name anymore of ESG and impact and everything else. I don't think it's serving us anymore. And I'm happy to answer your question, Tyson, about what's going on in ESG, but everyone kind of confuses all of these terms anyways. I just look at it as good investing and thematic investing, and that's what we all really know about as investors. And so that's what I'm going with now. Maybe there'll be a catchy title that we can come up with. But a family may care about and want to invest in housing, for instance. So we'll invest in multifamily housing or commercial real estate, and we'll do that across the board, both here and abroad, but more here. But you look at the affordable housing category as well. There, obviously a huge issue. Is there an investment thesis there? We think there is, and we've been underwriting that to market rate returns, and you get the impact as well. So things like affordable housing, we talk about DEI and the integration of having more equality across how corporations are operating, or fund managers getting assets, or companies getting started, and that's a big theme as well. There's obviously a lot in the food space, agriculture. That's been a big area, and that ties into climate. I do a lot in climate investing as well. All these things are what I think are great mega trends that are occurring, and investable thesis with potentially good investments or good investments. And for as long as I knock on wood, my life. One of the things I do want to highlight, which I think is a huge tailwinds for us, and I know we probably know a lot about this, but when I first heard about this, I did a lot of work on it. It's the Inflation Reduction Act. Now, everywhere I go, this is brought up. People who have funds, people who are investing, people who have companies. This has been, it's a landmark piece of legislation, and it's going to just support the whole space of the transitions that were occurring in our country right now, and also the reshoring story. So I think it's going to be a huge boon for us. It won't be straight up, but there's a lot of tailwinds, a lot of support. Think about, electricity, transport, and buildings as the three major categories. And that's really, we're really looking to do a lot of investments. That comes right into what you're doing, Andreas. And it's driven by a few things. So, from the government side, the investment in funding, tax credits, deductions, and penalties. So there's a good mix in there for that. The focus is on buildings, energy efficiency, carbon-free energy, transportation, and manufacturing. It's going to affect corporations. It affects and supports people, residential. It's U.S. oriented, localized manufacturing, and there's a good emphasis on environmental justice as well. And what are the benefits? Well, obviously, Inflation Reduction Act. The idea is it'll lower inflation, lower costs, U.S. competitiveness. What we're really looking at is the infrastructure build out in all these categories, and then energy security and decarbonization. All of these things fall under investment themes. I categorize them as efficient building and industry, clean energy, sustainable transportation, clean tech, green manufacturing, and sustainable agriculture, land, and conservation. That is enough just for myself, my colleagues, to do a lot of work on, to look for a lot of investments, and it'll go across the spectrum. So we all know about alternative vehicles, electric vehicles. There's going to be so many incentives in here to, as a person to buy them, as a manufacturer to create them, and all the sourcing and the materials have to be done in treaty companies. The other end, countries at the other end of the spectrum is the critical minerals. Same story there. So we've been looking at investments in that space as well. The OEMs are going to try to get offtake access to that. There's going to have to be this big EV charging build out. We know that that's an issue right now. And we're reading a lot about Tesla and how they really nailed it, but that'll just have to continue for everyone to feel comfortable. So these are big areas. They're complex. And some of it is, still a lot of work in progress, like carbon sequestration, carbon capture. That's going to have to go through a lot of iterations as well. And then nature-based solutions will actually benefit from this also, because I'm a big fan of looking at nature and how we can restore it more, but use it for carbon sink, use it for shoring up during adaptation. I'm a proponent of this kind of rewilding theory that's out there as well. I think we're going to have to move to rewilding a lot of our lands and moving people more into cities over the next few decades as well, and getting technology in here to make things more efficient. So that's a big category for us. We're going down every one of those rabbit holes. I think there's a lot of good opportunities, including, by the way, the nuclear space also. And I'll pause there on that. Tyson, on your question about ESG, my sense is that ESG is wounded, but it's not dead. I think it'll go through some iteration here, just like anything that occurs. The idea gets out there, the data starts to get in there, people start to jump on the wagon, they push the envelope. Now it's been politicized. At the end of the day, to me, it's important because ESG is impact is what you're doing, and ESG is how you're doing it. So as an investor, I care about both. And so I want both to continue to move forward. But ESG, I think we'll have to go through a couple iterations, clean out a bit. But this, there's been so much built into this story that it'll continue on forward, just in another rendition. Excuse me.
while you're coughing there, could you tell us what advice you would give Larry Fink?
I'm not gonna give Larry Fink any advice. Excuse me. But I hold on.
Can someone get him some water?
Yeah, we're on
We're on it.
Excuse me.
I don't have any liability insurance.
I think that the big fund companies have put the resources in to build out this whole structure. What's that? Oh, thank you. And that's going to continue. Whether or not some firms create products that are pushing the envelope, it'll all get kind of outed in a good way, I think. And they'll be moving forward to continue to iterate here. And I think it's all for the better, in essence, in terms of data, in terms of capturing information, in terms of governance. So I'm a continued fan of this, but I really focus more on impact itself. So what are the companies doing? How are they trying to improve society? Or are they doing something that, you know, you may want to short?
Sure.
Thank you. Oh, look at that. That's the alarm. You're dying there, and we have another very talented
Thanks.
panelist coming up, and her name is Nidhi Chadda, and Nidhi is the CEO of Enzo Advisors. It's a female, minority-led sustainability consulting practice that she founded, and she creates best-in-class sustainability models for companies as well as for institutional investors so that they can integrate ESG policies and frameworks across their investment processes. She did go to some good schools. She got a Harvard MBA and a Bachelor of Science in economics at Wharton. She worked for RBC Global Asset Management as a portfolio manager, and also worked at Fred Alger. And I'm going to throw a couple ideas that she may want to expand on. But what do you think ESG 2.0 looks like today in today's macro environment? And what are you hearing or seeing from your clients? Has market volatility impacted the level of ESG investing that is going on at corporations or institutional investment? And what are some of the challenges companies and investors are facing today in terms of adopting ESG standards? And how is technology helping to revolutionize the movement towards ESG and sustainability? And since you provided me those questions, I won't have to repeat them. So go ahead, Nidhi, please.
That's great, and a lot of content there, and I'll definitely weave that into the conversation. So hi everyone, nice to meet you all. My name is Nidhi Chadda. As Tyson said, I'm the founder and CEO of Enzo Advisors. We focus on helping both corporates and institutional investors across all asset classes with the ESG journey, and it's very customized depending on where they are. As you know, the term of ESG and sustainability really varies, and the understanding varies tremendously. So we typically spend most of our time with private, small, mid-cap companies, as well as institutional investors, typically in the range of 3 billion to 10 billion in AUM. And they could be global funds as well. And essentially, my journey in moving into ESG really started out when I was a portfolio manager. I spent 10 plus years in investment management. When I was at RBC Global Asset Management and co-managed 3 billion in assets across small, mid, and mid-cap growth, I really recognized the opportunity with ESG in factor integration and choosing some of the best-in-class business models. So my foray into ESG really started out as an investor. And so recognizing that these ESG factors really drive risk-adjusted returns, that's a lens from which I looked at ESG and got very excited to take the so-called leap of faith and build my business from there. With respect to the work that we do, just by a little bit of additional background for you all. So with corporations, we do everything from building out an ESG roadmap, benchmarking analysis, developing initiatives. They could be decarbonization initiatives, could be DEI. and then also reporting and communication. In addition to that, when we work with institutional investors, it really could be anything from developing an ESG policy, really is stage 0, and just thinking through that aspect of it, to ESG integration into the portfolio construction optimization, which is coming up more and more in conversations, and then also reporting and communication. There's no question that the investor landscape has changed tremendously, and there's a lot of interest in making sure that folks aren't greenwashing, and they want to make sure they have the credible data to support their investment profile. With respect to LPs, we also are working with, broadly speaking, pension funds, endowments. We've been approached by several parties who are early in their thought process and integrating ESG into how they look at their own investments, developing their own frameworks. We also actually are working on a DEI framework at the moment for a given pension fund, for them to think through how to best invest according to those principles and to track that across the portfolio. So spending a lot of time customizing that work from an investment lens. We also work with technology providers. We are really at the nexus of thinking about business strategy, finance, and incorporating technology, because without tech, Tyson, to your question, we really are going to be struggling to move forward in the ESG world, in a very timely fashion and in a way that everybody can at least get on the same page in light of this politicization, which I'll get to your comments. Broadly speaking, we are very focused on making sure we are educating folks about what is ESG/sustainability. I do agree with my fellow panelists that the term and acronym ESG is likely to wash to the wayside at this point. It's really going to be about thinking through sustainability and how sustainability is a driver of competitive advantage. With respect to your question on ESG 2.0 and what that landscape looks like for both corporates and institutional investors. So what is really interesting, Tyson, is that we have seen still a continued number of conversations happening, both with corporates and with institutional investors. With institutional investors, what we are seeing right now is, yes, there is a lot more discussion around the politicization that is falling into the discussion about ESG integration. So as an example, we were sitting with a private equity firm very recently. They were pitching to a pension fund, and the first question was, red state or blue state? What are we thinking about here? So there are more questions about the politicization. However, ESG 2.0 is, in our view, is really going to be about not what is ESG, but what defines ESG from a risk mitigation and a value creation perspective. What is the financial impact of these ESG factors, and how do we prove this? And what are we seeing so far, both in the public markets as well as in the private? With that in mind, although we have seen a pullback on the sustainable funds and the inflows quarter over quarter, there has been some softness in the U.S. largely due to technology. Sorry, just a lot of background noise. That's largely due to technology. We know that with the markets, but beyond that, when folks look beyond that, what's been interesting is that when we see situations like the SVB fallout and other regional bank failures and discussion around that, it's been a wake-up call for the industry, because they're not as much reliant upon the ESG ratings, because unfortunately the ESG ratings did get a lot of things wrong and really misaligned a number of investors. So we're actually seeing an investment group that's more engaged in trying to understand what these factors mean from an investment lens. And that is the case both from a private equity and a public equities standpoint. We also are seeing that continued trend in credit. Now that we've seen a pickup in private credit, there's a lot more interest in thinking about these ESG factors in the private credit landscape as well. I would say on the corporate side, it's been a very interesting journey, because energy transition and what my fellow panelists have talked about, it's happening, it's real, it's not changing. We're not, that is a secular tailwind to come. And we are still seeing a lot of movement and investment on decarbonization initiatives, irrespective of whether or not SEC even comes out and formally announces anything on Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. So we are seeing that movement in corporations. We are seeing folks investing in that. There's a lot more multidisciplinary groups that are being formed at corporations. And so that interest is there to move forward on this. In addition, we are also seeing a lot more carbon conscious R&D investments being made by companies. I could say even with an oil and gas company that we're working with, they're spending around 15% of their R&D in carbon conscious product development, which is very interesting. They're getting more and more questions from their customers, because even though scope 3 emissions across the value chain, for those who are newer to the concept, are not mandatory at this point in the US, they are mandatory for a lot of our international companies. And because of that pressure, that is diving into the US market. So we are seeing that movement with respect to regulations that's driving the demand, and the focus on the financial impact of it is real, as we are seeing a lot more multidisciplinary approaches coming together with respect to corporations, even when they are having lean teams, which I think has been very, very interesting, broadly speaking. So I agree, ESG is, and however you want to frame it, the concept of sustainability is here to stay. It's a big part of deciding what is a company's key competitive advantage. It's how we as investors think about a lot of those non-financial factors, and it's just really putting a framework around it. So I think when we get past, hopefully get past some of this political noise, and we can showcase some of the value creation, that's really going to be ESG 2.0. And I'll pause there and can continue with technology.
We have some questions here in the audience.
Sure.
Yep. Mr. Steve McCarthy speaking.
Just out of the last 5 to 10 years, I'd be curious to know, how has the college endowment world adopted to ESG? Obviously, back in the day, there were the Sullivan principles, et cetera, et cetera. How's college endowments moved in that? You're talking, Nidhi, about the corporates and institutions and pension funds. Is that an area on the college endowment side that has embraced it or not?
That's a great question. And what we are seeing is that they actually started to embrace it more recently. There is more interest in looking at carbon footprinting, looking at some of the decarbonization initiatives for them as an operation. So we're getting a lot more questions around that. There's a lot more technology providers that are focused on the college and university market to really hone in on carbon footprinting. So that's something newer as a trend that we are starting to see. Diversity and inclusion has always been there, but there's been no formalized framework for it. So now the conversations around that are, how do we go about developing a formalized framework on DEI so we can better manage our portfolio and make sure we're tracking this in a consistent way. So although conceptually these ideas were there, it's only now that either technology and or just working with third parties, these firms, endowments are able to actually put a process in place. And that is something we're starting to see now.
Nidhi, do you have publications? Tyson, I'm sorry, I'm going to interrupt you for a couple of minutes here, Nidhi. Do you have publications that you put out, or do you have indices or what am I looking for? Different ways of measuring performance, KPIs?
Are you talking from a public markets perspective or just broadly KPIs across the company?
I'm talking about for you as a consultancy. Do you have media that you put out, a periodical or like a newsletter, alerts, things like that, or,
Yes. So I guess for us as a firm, when we work with companies, we are looking at both improving their initiatives from a decarb or S standpoint. And so although we have NDAs with our clients, we are able to talk about some of the initiatives that we've put in place. So some of the KPIs that we're going to be looking at, even as a firm for our clients, are what type of emissions reduction have we taken with respect to a corporation? What's the time frame, and how credible is the data to support that, to make sure we're doing that in a very credible fashion. We also look at initiatives being launched on the social side, the impact both from a dollar standpoint as well as employee engagement standpoint, community impact standpoint. So we're similarly to corporations, we're tracking those same metrics to see what our clients are doing. And we also do that for us as a firm. We actually every year invest in charities to support a cause that we are looking at just as a firm in entirety, in addition to having a program to support some of the young generation and their work in ESG. But from a corporation and looking at the client standpoint, we also look at fundraising for our clients. So how much of AUM has been raised in light of ESG integration, better ESG integration. That's something we also are internally tracking on our end. We also are tracking from our perspective, again, DEI, looking at the DEI positioning across some of the funds we are working with. For some of the longer term clients, we can actually start to see progress in terms of retention, hiring practices, engagement, et cetera. Turnover is another one that we look at. So we have a lot of qualitative and quantitative measures that we track internally for our purposes. We are actually going to be posting very soon about value creation to this point, as well as talking about ESG integration and M&A. We are getting a lot of questions about how to to integrate ESG templates into mergers and acquisitions in a of course in an environment that is improved from where we are today. But a lot of questions around that. So if you're interested, definitely email me and we'll keep you in the loop and put you in our distribution list.
And your work is primarily domestic United States?
We do about 80%, I'd say, is US, and the remainder would be Europe, and we have 1 or 2 clients in Asia.
Yeah, we have another question?
Camille's
Nidhi,
got a
it
question.
seems, Nidhi, my name is Camille Hamji and I am an LP and I invest into ESG since 2014. I find through the years, as the issue is evolving, that we are going ahead of ourselves, especially the media, the government in regulation, and also many of the pundits that are collecting data. Most of today, when we see in 2-3 years that we have so many indices that focus on ESG, and also rating agencies, Morningstar and Morgan Stanley, Capital International, and also Bloomberg and many others, that in a very short period of time, when we collect so much data, that means most of this data is voluntarily submitted. And that tells me that there is a lot of greenwashing, which we know about greenwashing. Richard earlier said ESG is wounded, but is not dead. Correct, Richard? So we're going to ask Richard also about to more elaborate further on how is it wounded and by whom. And would you agree with me that we're going ahead of ourselves because ESG does not apply to every project, to every sector of the economy? And today that we have a bifurcated world, the world of the East used a lot of iron ore. I mean, China buys its ore from Mongolia, from Russia, from Indonesia, and from Azerbaijan. Now, those countries have a revenue stream when they sell to Russia. What are we gonna say to them? And the West, even here in America, we still have 262, according to yesterday I looked, 262 factories in America that are fired by coal.
Yeah.
So what do you? Again, I go back. Are we going ahead of ourselves with this?
Yes.
For all fairness to ESG.
I agree with that. Great question. Actually, a perfect segue to some of the challenges that we are seeing in the ESG space.
And Nidhi, can I just, I'm going to interrupt. I wanted you to answer, Camille, I'm going to make a remark. We promoted this event. One of our speakers, who's probably the largest investor out of Southern California in ESG, and we promoted it as ESG in the first 2 weeks, and we had a dozen emails come back to us that were beyond flaming, go kill myself sort of things. We changed the title of his presentation from ESG to carbon neutral. I haven't gotten a negative email response since. Anyway.
There you go. There you go. But let me talk about the challenges, because it is very critical for us to be realistic about that. You are 100% correct that we have gotten ahead of ourselves. Why? Because there's this inflow of capital, especially even on private capital, where we've just seen money flow into, whether it's climate tech, whether it's ESG technology, data solutions, etc. And we've seen what some of those so-called rating agencies have done with respect to some of the work. I mean, they've essentially monopolized the entire industry. Now, what that has resulted in is really 4 different key problems that we're dealing with right now. One is, to your point, data collection. There is no question in my mind, this is a very big problem, because to your point, even if you have a technology that can help you collect data, whether you're an LP, GP, or a corporation, some of that input is incorrect because people are still trying to understand how to input the data. So much so, I'll give you all an anecdotal example that I work with an oil and gas company, and they literally added numbers for input raw material spend, US dollars plus pounds, A plus B, no conversion. That's how bad the data is from an input standpoint. And so, yes, you're 100% correct. We need to take pause in how those inputs are putting in. And the regulations did scare people. So the fact that we actually now have pushback on timing for scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions is a little bit helpful, but there's still a lot of fear that we're going to rush into something that we're not prepared to, which of course will cause more confusion in the investment market about, what is truly integrating ESG. And honestly, how many of these companies are greenwashing? The second point and the second problem is that companies felt so much pressure to put in net zero commitments that they all went out and said net zero by 2050 or carbon neutral. And then when it comes time to have a plan, 10%, less than 10% have a plan. In fact, 5% do. which is horrendous, right? So that's another challenge that they're starting to deal with, is how do we walk back on those commitments that we have already made? So that's a second problem. The terminology confusion we've already touched upon. That's already caused a problem. The other thing is cultural mind shift and thinking about how relevant ESG is. ESG hits, or sustainability, however you want to call it, it hits risk, finance, strategy, operations, procurement, everything. Supply chain, it hits every aspect and every facet and function. And companies are still grappling with how to track this internally, and as well as to measure internally progress against those initiatives. So even if a company launches sustainability, who's responsible for issuing it? Who's responsible for tracking it and monitoring it? So that cultural mind shift is a problem. Investment land, it's the same issue as well, because a lot of investors, especially lean firms, don't see any reason to look at this actual concept because there's so much politicization, and that is actually throwing them a way to just avoid the topic entirely. And they say, well, we don't need to worry about this because ESG funds are underperforming in the market, thanks to what we've seen in market volatility. And by the way, the politicization is just making it too difficult to have our investments get committed to this. So that's been definitely a big problem, as has been the resource allocation and training. Across the board, a lot of companies are not spending capital on training as well.
So you touch also on the
More
regulator.
more questions, Tyson.
The regulator, Marty. We need and Nidhi, if you can address also the position of the regulator, where it's making it difficult for many companies to really participate. And we know that the SFDR has been revised 2 times already. And then every year on March 10, since 2021, they have been rejecting 20 to 24% of the companies that they claim to be participant of Chapter 9. So last year, they created in Europe Chapter 8, where you have flexibility, but that's a gray area. So we're lying to ourselves. We have to come to reality, to where it applies, where it does not apply, where it applies partially.
Agree completely. And the other problem, and I would throw in one more alphabet soup, CSRD, right? That's the other one that's now come up for a lot of the small mid-cap companies. And again, you're right that the basically taking some of these and adhering to it has been a problem in Europe. I would also add that Article 689, for those who are European LPs or invest in companies out in Europe, you'll know what I'm talking about here, is that, from an investment lens standpoint, a lot of those companies that were going for the most extreme rating, they had to come back and say, you know what, we can't do ESG integration. And we're seeing the same problem with PRI, by the way. I'm seeing that right now, real time. People have signed up for PRI signatories. It's gone up and to the right in terms of signatory AUM growth. And then you sit down with every investor and they don't even know how to start filling this out in a credible fashion. So you are absolutely right that we have gotten way ahead of ourselves on regulation, but we also, as a globally, we need to align too. That's the other problem, is that what do you do, right? You're a global economy. How do we have one standard in the US and another in Europe, and then there's no alignment there? And I see this on the LP discussions all the time, right? We talk to venture funds and they say, we get this RFP from Europe and we get this one from the US. The Europe one, there's like, we can't even touch it. It's too confusing. It's too much detail. So there has to be that kind of alignment, which we just aren't there yet, which I believe is a big challenge in this market.
Tyson, this is Rob. Quick question for Richard and maybe Andreas here. Richard, you mentioned, I think We Family Office managing 50 plus families or so, right? I don't think the ESG drive is necessarily driven by the second or third generation. I would imagine you have inputs from the first gen, because some of them recognize, both carbon or things like defense. But I think where the rubber hits the road, can you speak a little bit about generational dynamics? And then Andreas,
Sure.
You have sort of this policy hat with going to Davos and what have you. Just I'd be interested to hear that.
So my view is extremely anecdotal here, right, with a small sample. What we had seen is there were more women and the next generations that were sort of moving this forward in our families. That's kind of the statistics they're seeing in the polling of the family office industry or even high net worth industry. So that's been consistent, but I think that was really just the beginning of it, and then others been pulled along as well. And so I think there's a good mix. Trying to separate ESG from impact. If you think about impact, you just think about these mega trends that are occurring in the world right now. it's just a great time. It's going to be a tough period in our lives, right? But a good period also. But there's just great investment opportunity. And so no matter what demographic or generation you are, you can sit back and say, well, wait, there's opportunity here. If we have climate change that is less of a controversial question, right, in any side of the equation, and it's coming closer to home, right? We have regulation, we have the technology boom, we have the energy transition, we have the EV transition. There's so many things that are going on right now that you would think, wow, I want all these tailwinds to help me as an investor. That's just helping my thesis. So if we just sit back and say renewable energy, energy efficiency, heat pumps, high efficiency lighting, low carbon infrastructure. And Marty, this is all about your topic of decarbonization. So how do you emit less CO2 equivalent? How do you pull some down? How do you store more? This is going to be the big issue of the world. And how do we operate in that by making these transitions? So if it's EV battery, EV charging, sustainable fuels, biofuels, grid enhancements, this space just has so many tailwinds to it that no matter what sort of demographic you are, and even probably what you want to think about ESG, however you want to define it, there's a great investment thesis here. I think ESG fits in it as well because every manager that we talk to and the underlying companies are all trying to do it better as well. It's very important to them that they do it better because they know that there's a demand for it and it'll make them better companies as well. But it's the impact that we're interested in.
So just add on, going to COP27 and some of these other events, there seems to be a division, not just east-west, but global north and south, the south being sub-Saharan Africa and so on and so forth. So when a hurricane hits Malawi, the prime minister of Malawi says, well, that's because we Westerners in the global north have caused the hurricane with our polluting, and we owe them money. And anecdotally, it seems that in these various conferences across the board, it's the women leaders that are taking up that charge much more so than the men. In terms of intergenerational, my own personal experiences, my son and his schoolmates blame me and my generation for the global warming. And I, of course, am going to turn on my father and say it's his fault, but we're all here and we need to do something. And then getting back to the heat pumps, I think we're talking about solutions that by and large are supply side driven. And we're living in a world where our culture is of consumption and convenience. And that's the big part of the equation that we really need to manipulate culturally. I think we want to make some really big inroads going forward.
That's a brilliant point. And one thing we forget, people don't even know what kilowatt hours are. Point being, utilities charge and get paid for how much enough in English. And what I'm trying to say is that the more electricity a utility sells, the cheaper it is. There are a lot of technologies in what they call demand side utility planning that I was involved in. The technologies exist where you can reduce the lumen output by 70%. But the utilities, no one invests in it because they can't make a profit, because the utilities, the more electricity they spend, the cheaper it is, et cetera. And Camille, you talk about solid waste, same thing in solid waste management. So these issues are now, I guess, being driven by ESG, which is important, but they've been around for a long time in the 1970s.
So what's the question?
The question is, are we addressing public service commissions to get the utility companies to integrate this into their demand side planning?
So I'm going to say this another way. Alternative energy is big on the West Coast. They just made dams, hydropower illegal in Oregon. It's likely to happen again in Washington State. And California is has lost more energy from losing dam hydroelectric power than it's created from alternative energy, right? And actually, there's no willpower to sustain infrastructure in this country. Bridges are collapsing, and a dam collapse couple of years ago that killed, so many people and wiped out a town. So that's the question is, as much ESG energy as you create, is there any will to sustain the existing infrastructure of hydropower? Right, because if you lose all the hydropower, which used to be 50% of the energy in the United States is hydropower, back in like 1910, if you lose all that, then all of your other alternative energy won't make it up.
Or if you could use
Any thoughts
less,
on that?
but if you could use less electricity.
Well, California uses 15% less electricity than it did in 1995 with 10 million more people now, and it has the most expensive electricity in the country.
The population in 1910 was close to 115 million people in this country.
Yeah.
Today we are pushing 340.
Numbers
So
are-
the demand make a difference.
You are right. I agree. Yeah. I'm just saying, there's no willpower in this country to pay attention to infrastructure.
Even the water, I mean, look at the Hoover Dam. The Hoover Dam today, 30% of what it was when it was built in Nevada. So hydropower require water.
Yes. Right. So I don't know, Nidhi, maybe you have some commentary on the will of the US to maintain infrastructure for hydropower or other sorts of energy that requires infrastructure.
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to some of the bill summaries that we've seen, and was highlighted earlier as well. Like once you have these types of infrastructure bills out there and IRA, things of that nature, there's just an increased focus in that market. So with utilities specifically, some of the stuff that we actually see is less so, I mean, of course, the investments are happening from an infrastructure standpoint, but we also are seeing a lot more in terms of leveraging some of the work that they've done with respect to incorporating sustainability in infrastructure and tying it to green financing mechanisms. So the big debate that I see in utilities is, well, we've got these targets out there. We're looking at sustainable financing, and we want to make sure that, we're moving towards those KPIs. So I see a lot of that on the utilities front. The large cap utilities, the AEPs of the world, the Eversources, I mean, they're all doing a great job, with respect to the investments. But the ones that are the regionals players, mid-sized, mid-cap players, they're struggling quite a bit. So they're very early days of trying to figure out where to think about infrastructure, and those are conversations we're having today.
We have a question from Steve McCarthy.
Just, you mentioned infrastructure, popped into my head. China seems to be one of the largest funders of infrastructure globally. And there's been lots of articles out there about how the loan programs have essentially capitated many of the African countries and whatever.
Loan to own.
Yeah, loan. So the question is, do they have the ability, China, to leapfrog us because they have the power and financial power to do some of these good things? Or are they just playing games from a geopolitical point of view to get access to Africa and other places like that? What are you seeing in terms of China as an infrastructure investor as opposed to Europe and US? Are there big differences in terms of the way they operate? Nidhi or other people? Next, is that a decent question?
Area of an economic.
Well, I think that it's one of my favorite books, but there's a Republic of Congo is a great example where something like 95% of some rare earth comes from there, but 90% of people don't have electricity.
Right.
Because Europe won't sell them technology for making it.
Right.
Same thing in Nigeria.
Exactly what China's doing. The difference now is that the Chinese send their prisoners to do the infrastructure work.
Yes.
We never did that.
Correct.
But, Steve, this week, U.S. Department of Energy just back was like a $9.5 billion loan for the Kentucky and Tennessee on the battery facility for them, but by Ford.
Interesting.
It was Ford, and then the counterparties are LG, the Koreans. So, I mean, I think, the US is playing catch-up ball, but that was an aggressive move. This wasn't backing some just startup. This was, backing Ford.
No, and that's part of what the Biden administration is promoting is infrastructure, but we're still way late to the game compared to what China is doing with its dollars and its firepower geopolitically.
We're not good at it too, right?
Yeah, well,
That's the other side of the story, right?
yeah.
Yeah, I would-
Richard, good.
I was
Nidhi.
just gonna say, I was separately, I don't know if India is a market of interest for you all, but that's definitely one that we're looking at very closely because they have had mandatory reporting requirements on some of their business social responsibility reporting. Granted, they have their own challenges, from an infrastructure standpoint, population and all that, but that is an interesting market where there is reporting requirements that are moving ahead. So it's one market that if you haven't looked at, definitely would suggest, and happy to follow up offline with anyone on that.
Richard, just a quick question. Do you guys view Tesla as an ESG play? Because I bring it up.
That's interesting.
I bring it up because, we touch on electrification, but the biggest thing you're going to get a captive audience, whether it's first or third generation,
Right.
is economic return. And Tesla's one that's actually showing,
Yeah, well, first of all, we don't judge individual companies, so I can't speak for my company. We choose managers who
speak about it.
we don't judge individual company. I don't have a view for my company on Tesla. So we're going to choose managers and they're going to take the view. So just want to put that out there.
You're a fiduciary.
Yeah, but we also don't pick stocks.
No, I understand what you're
So,
saying, but you.
Yeah, and we're a fiduciary. Yeah, so I can't comment from my company's point of view. Just kind of riffing here. Look, Tesla's done an enormous service to what this transition that's occurring. How it plays out. I'm not a Tesla expert, so I can't say. But the fact that they were able to sort of move forward to this position, and now all the other big OEMs are following in some way or in the other. And now clearly the trump card that they have is the charging stations. We're seeing that play out right now as well. That's just helping us with this transition. Tesla themselves, I don't know. I have friends who really know it very well. Everyone has a different view. But in terms of if I sit back and say, okay, what's the thing that got this going for us to make a shift from the internal combustion engine to some other alternative? It's clearly one of the key players in that. But we have to Marty's point and others on infrastructure, we have to build out this EV charging infrastructure. And to talk about being ahead, I mean, you can produce cars faster than I guess you can do this infrastructure. So I think there's going to sort of fits and starts of this as we transition over the next decade.
Yeah, and I guess the question is, they project you need 1 million more stations in the United States, right? 1 million more charging stations. Is it easier just to move to hydrogen, create liquid hydrogen, and then just pop in, fuel tanks into your trunk of your car and do that migration?
I mean, I was bringing it up because of the fact that this wasn't a charity, this wasn't a subsidy, this is something that's giving real market return to both, individuals and the funds. And I guess this is a deeper question for like the Baron Capitals of the world or the ARK Invest, which have taken big, long positions on Tesla.
Yeah.
I think Tesla did get government funding on their EV batteries though, right? So.
Yeah,
But
I can actually comment on that. If you'd like.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Nidhi.
Yeah, let me just comment on how that would work. So great question. It's actually something we looked at a couple of years back because this was very controversial from a ratings perspective. The ratings were literally saying opposite ends. Is either the winner from an ESG rating standpoint because of E and they ignored the S side, or we saw that some folks actually did pick up on the fact that they had the social issues. So what we actually did a couple of years back was we ran a sentiment indicator. So we looked at various websites to see what the feedback was from a social standpoint of people who had formerly worked there, people are working there, what they're saying in social media, and it actually came up as a big red flag. And so from an investment lens standpoint, I'm going to put my ESG investor hat on because this is what we do for our investors is, well, if you wanted to look at Tesla from a stock standpoint, we're looking at ESG factors. It needs to meet the criteria, no question, from a financial return standpoint, earnings profile standpoint. However, we overlay that with an ESG checklist to see where that company would fit. Now, if you are an investor and you didn't own Tesla and you're tracking against the bench, you probably missed a pretty significant move potentially. So you have to be mindful of your benchmark. But if you could justify your own analysis with the overlay of ESG and see where that company scores, that is actually how most portfolio managers will decide whether or not they want to move forward. And I would say 100% of clients I deal with, 100%, if they have an investment they like from a financial return standpoint, and there is an ESG red flag, they will follow up with that company to identify if that's a red flag that could impact earnings. And then they would decide whether or not to invest in it or size appropriately. I've not seen that ESG factor, such as like a social concept on Tesla, be a deal breaker potentially for an investment. And so that's kind of how we've seen the ESG integration unfold in public markets.
Any other commentary? Tyson, yep, we're over time, but you can ask a question or two more if you like, Tyson.
Marty, if
So
you don't
yeah,
mind.
I'd like to just say something. I think that what has been pointed out by Camille and answered by our three talented panelists is spot on. And it reminds me of Winston Churchill, who said, if you're not a liberal when you're young, you don't have a heart. And if you're not a conservative when you're older, you don't have a brain. I think the real issue here is that the idea is correct. The implementation is failing, and it's failing on a couple different axes. And I think one was pointed out by Andreas. There is a generational thing. Maybe there's a gender factor. But the reality is, and I know John Doerr over at Kleiner Perkins had laid out a framework for ESG that maybe Nidhi can do this, over the weekend. It's a long weekend. Build out a global optimization of pragmatics so that we can get the Chinese and the Indians to stop burning all the coal and really kind of optimize for both ESG as well as all the other benefits of this effort. But it's that's why we're here. That's why we're having this conference. And
Tyson, there's another question here, Camille?
go ahead.
I
fire
just
away.
want to propose a new name for it. I want to call it conscientious and responsible investing.
I think it's been around for a while, yeah, sure. We've been doing this for 20 years, guys. It's not so
Richard said
many-
it's one day, but it's not dead. So let's come up with something.
I think it was rooted, it was ill-conceived.
Fourth school at the bottom of the pyramid, C.K. Frawlett, Stu Hart.
CIT.
This is not new and it hasn't been terribly successful. We keep trying it with different names. Unfortunately, it hasn't impacted the way we hoped.
It's been in the family office space for a long time. I mean, we've been hearing this stuff.
But the point I had made is that you take a look at shifting the global economy through this process, and you're sitting at $32 trillion in debt in the United States, and you think about the trillions of dollars that has to be put into this over multiple decades, the political will is just non-existent. It may be episodic in Kentucky or maybe episodic in small parts, and maybe the states can move quicker than the federal government, or Germany can do something different, but it's episodic and anecdotal and every once in a way. It's not a global wave because we've got way too much debt in the whole global economy. That's the problem.
We actually talked about it this morning, but I think one thing we have to understand is what is kind of playing with numbers. So you've been around, we've all been around for a long time. We know that when it came to creating the European Union, that Italy, Spain, and Greece did not qualify. And the only reason why they did is because Goldman Sachs wrote some options trades for them so that they could push all of their deficits to 10 years forward.
Yeah.
Right. And they've had dispensations, et cetera, COVID, et cetera. And so what we have is happening in ESG as well, where there's no way Europe will reach its targets for buildings in 2027. So they're going to change the rules later. And there's almost no way the United States will reach it, because even without gasoline, we still use petroleum in so many products, right? So there has to be some kind of a factual basis to move forward on. So, and maybe Nidhi has some perspective on that as well, where
Short-term milestones.
yeah, short-term, like real management, right?
Yeah, no, that's exactly the problem. And one thing we do see with climate tech, just generally speaking, is of course a lot of hype to look at these very exciting technologies, but if they're not scalable and they can't do anything in the near term, how do companies navigate through investing in that? And then think about ROI. It has to come back to the ROI at the end of the day. And that's what ESG 2.0 is about, in our view, is that why does this matter? How does it drive returns? How does it create value? And how do we mitigate risk? How do we quantify that? And if we can't have data to support that, then it's not going to move forward in accelerated fashion.
Nidhi, you're preaching to the choir, because in a lot of respects, there are aspects where the venture capital solution sounds really sexy, but nobody will ever implement it because it's so costly to try to lay out infrastructure across the United States.
Yeah, but Marty, they could have said that about batteries.
There are many private equity solutions that there are lots of companies that actually have off-takers for their product set that can be done today if they get the right financing. And unfortunately, with banks pulling back in financing, that's going to dry up, right? So,
One more point.
yeah, one more point.
You know how China was built? BOT, build, operate, and transfer. The Japanese and Taiwanese put the money in, the US was number
See you in
3.
September.
I used to have an office in Shanghai back in the 90s for 3 years. It was all BOT. They took the money in, and in 20 years they own it. But during that meantime, I don't know why we're not doing more of that in this country. Getting private enterprise to support our infrastructure improvements. I don't get it. Maybe somebody has an answer.
Did you?
I don't have an answer, but having made the IMF, World Bank, the UN and all that, the people that are making the rules, like 2035 will do this, 2050, they're not going to be empowered, not going to be alive when those deadlines are here. And they're all well-meaning people, but they're all working within the construct as they've known it all their life. I think we need a new construct. It's no longer we're a big army. We need like the Navy SEALs doing shit right now, get shit done.
Hey,
Pardon
Kevin,
language.
Kevin, when you did the South Soviet water deal, was water considered an ESG play then? Because when I worked on a water deal in Asia, it was.
I've done water, as you know, right? We did the pure filters with Procter & Gamble.
Yeah, but the Soviet, the consumer stuff, was that considered water, ESG?
Yes, part of it, yes, definitely.
I think you'd also
Well,
find interesting.
couldn't we get the, yep, sorry. Nidhi.
Sorry, I was just gonna mention on that point, we were in talks recently with the UN as a client, and I could tell you just from the public-private partnerships and all the challenges we have, there's still a lot of in-house knowledge that needs to really get passed on within folks there. For example, when they were exploring launching a private fund tied to UN SDGs, they were actually concerned about, getting some of the banks involved because they said the banks have oil and gas interests. So where do you go? Where do you find a bank with no oil and gas exposure? And so there's a lot of challenges of trying to navigate through that and setting up a precedent, which actually they're still learning and trying to figure out because they don't want to look like, here's the UN supporting oil and gas. They're trying to figure out who do we work with, but they need the private capital to launch the fund. So there's this constant push and pull. And in fact, we were talking to, various LPs and family offices because we needed to find investors that aren't looking, with that oil and gas exposure, particularly from the bank standpoint.
Okay, so we aren't back until September, so why don't you guys each take a minute or two for closing statements?
I can kick it off. Well, thanks everyone for your time. Very engaging discussion. It was nice to see us rise beyond the politics and really talk about actual economics, ideas, and themes. I did want to mention, if you have any questions or you want to discuss any topics offline, my email is on my screen right now. We also are doing idea dinners. So idea dinners are back in vogue in September. We are doing that with GPs and we're doing it with LPs. If you guys are interested, let us know. We have 4 to 6 investors that come at each go around. So just keep us posted. And we also are launching a new product on sustainable agriculture in terms of portfolio model solutions. If that's a topic of interest, please message me directly as well. But thank you all for your time and awesome questions.
Thank you, Nidhi.
Richard?
Andreas?
Richard?
I always enjoy coming here, Marty. Thank you, everybody. It's so fun. You guys are great. Thank you. A lot of good ideas, a lot of good investments out there. So happy to chat with anybody after this and continue the conversation. Thank you.
Yeah, this is not necessarily uplifting, but when I think about this whole ESG situation, the one thing that leaps to my mind is something that Nietzsche said many years ago. Divided responsibility equals no responsibility. We need to put that responsibility on something or someone to get this done. Happy to talk to anybody after or via email later.
Wait, Tyson, you're the master. Closing statement.
Tyson.
I'm looking forward to Nidhi putting together a global optimization of so that, and throw in kind of a carbon tax transcending all different asset classes so that the evil money makers are helping to slowly finance the new and burgeoning promising ESG technology.
Tyson, I promise you'll do that if Richard invests in my product so that 20% can come right to this product.
And I get 1%.
All right, guys, great job. Thanks so much. Have a great
Thank
summer.
you.